All right, this is the Florida Bar and Florida Realtors approved residential lease for single family homes and duplexes. So the operative instruction for completing this form is right here, that a box or a blank indicates a provision where a choice needs to be made. As you read the form, it's going to be fairly self-explanatory where things are not going to be applicable to your situation. I always prefer to fill an NA or put a dash into a blank where it otherwise looks like it would need completion, just to be sure that people understand there wasn't an intention that things, that something was missed. All right, so you're going to fill parties into clause 1, and then you're going to fill contact information here below. So name and address of the property owner as the landlord, name and address of the person to whom the property is leased, and then all of their pertinent contact information. In situations where there's an agent in charge, there's going to be another section that gives opportunity to disclose that. The property rented section in clause 2 talks about everything that's going to be a part of the lease agreement. So you have the property address, and then this section here is everything that is furniture and fixtures. So typically you're going to want to include range, refrigerator, cooktop, microwave, washer and dryer, all light fixtures, all ceiling fans, window blinds and curtains if they're applicable, and if there's furnishings, list those things out explicitly as well. The actual structure of the house doesn't need to be explicit, but anything that is plugged in, wired in, it's better to make that as clear as possible. Okay, the term of the agreement, fairly self-explanatory. You're going to want to do no more than a 12-month term. It is actually illegal in the state of Florida to write a lease for more than 12 months on behalf of someone else without an attorney's involvement. So better to write the lease for a year and then sign an extension if, say, you had somebody that you wanted to lease for 14 months because of timing, things like that. I would always encourage write a 12-month lease and then write an addendum extending for the 2 additional. Do keep in mind that any lease term of less than 6 months, actually 6 months or less, is subject to hotel occupancy taxes like an Airbnb. So you want to make sure you're not writing short-term leases. It would be better to write a year-long lease and give them the right to terminate at a future date with no termination fee or notice if that is a situation that is needed for you. All right, clause 4 talks about rent payments. The tenant will pay total rent in the amount of blank, excluding taxes. So if the lease were for 12 months at $1,000 a month, this number would actually be $12,000. That is the total amount of the rent, right? And then if they're paying it monthly, you would check off they're paying it in installments monthly on the probably first day of the month in the amount of $500 rent per installment. I'm sorry, my example. $1,000 rent per installment. So there's 12 equal payments of $1,000 is how we come to the total of $12,000. There are provisions to allow for weekly or full payment. Those are not oft used. Okay. Page 2 talks about taxes on the rental. There shouldn't be any taxes in a regular long-term residential lease, but if there were, say you were writing a 4-month agreement, you would write the amount of the taxes and when they were due in there. Not going to be applicable to most situations. So then you're going to reiterate the total amount of the payment due at each installment. So in this example, rent is paid in installments. There are no taxes. The total amount due at each installment is going to be $1,000, right? Rent payments will be delivered to whom? This is going to be the landlord's address by default, unless something else is written in. So say, for example, you wanted a manager or someone else to take payments for you, that information would be filled in there. That can be changed by written notice in the future. So keep that in mind. If tenancy is going to start on a day other than the first of the month, there's going to be an opportunity to prorate right here. So you could say somebody's moving in on the 16th of June. June has 30 days. So June 16th to June 30th, there's going to be a half a month's rent due. I made my math easy there on purpose. So there'd be a $500 proration due on the date that it's due, and always going to be divided on a 30-day month, right? So they're half a month's rent because the 16th through the 30th is half the month. The day of occupancy always belongs to the person occupying. So they do pay rent for the day they're there. The day they move in and the day they move out, they pay rent. Okay? As far as payments, the default is going to be that they pay rent by any legal tender. So if you want to restrict that, you want to make sure that's in the agreement. I wouldn't encourage accepting cash, maybe not even personal checks, but money orders, cashier's checks, or you could fill in other payment methods, whether that's an ACH, like a Venmo or Cash App, something like that. However, it's going to be tendered. If the tenant makes payment with a worthless check, you can require them to pay future payments by some other method. So basically, like say you were going to accept personal checks in the beginning, but then they bounced a personal check. You may want to require then certified funds for every payment they're on, and you can determine a bad check fee that they're subject to if that were to happen. So say they give you a personal check, the check bounces. What I understand is the maximum allowable by law is a $35 fee or 4%, whichever is greater. So that's what I would fill in to that provision there. Money due prior to occupancy is going to list out everything that they're supposed to pay before they move in. This number should be the sum of all of these numbers. So if, for example, they're paying first month's rent of $1,000 and that's due on June 15th, right? And they're paying a security deposit of $1,000 and that's due on June 1st at the signing of the lease, then the total amount due prior to occupancy would be $2,000. If there were pet fees or deposits or anything else, those numbers would change accordingly. Okay. Page 3, late fees. It is permissible to charge a late fee. I write all of my leases to be due no later than the 3rd. So I would put this like this. Say if a payment is made 2+ days or greater than 2 days after the commencement or after the payment period, then it's late. And if left blank, the default is a 4% late fee. So on $1,000, they would pay a $40 late fee for rent that was paid delinquent. You can also impose daily late fees. Oops, where did that go? Can also impose daily late fees if you want. This lease just doesn't permit for it. You'd have to impose that some other way. Put it in special clauses or whatever. Pets and smoking. You would only check this box if you want to allow a pet. Then you would specify the number, the type of the pet, just for clarity's sake. You would only check this box if you're going to allow smoking in the premises. In is the operative word. They can always smoke on the grounds. They're never going to be permitted to just litter the place with cigarette butts or joints or whatever, but always going to have permission to smoke outside. Just in the property is what requires special provision. In terms of notices, the landlord is going to be the default unless there's an agent that is specified here. Utilities are going to be assumed to be the responsibility of the tenant unless there's something listed here that the landlord is going to be providing. So say, for example, in a fully furnished or a fully inclusive situation, you may outline here electric, sewer, water, trash, cable, internet, lawn service, something like that as far as utilities that are included. Maintenance responsibilities are outlined here. The default is for the landlord to be responsible for everything unless a T is filled in for a default for tenant. Okay, so if, for example, the tenant is going to be responsible for changing smoke detectors or batteries or installing air filters, then you're going to fill T's into those blanks. Otherwise, it's going to be the responsibility of the landlord, and the tenant will notify the landlord at landlord's address, unless another address is filled in here, of needed services. Okay. Page 4. The box up here would be checked only if you want to allow a tenant to transfer the lease without your permission to someone else. If the box is not checked, the tenant may not assign the lease or sublease any or all of the property to someone else without first obtaining your written approval. 12, you're going to talk about what you're giving them. Maybe 2 keys to the dwelling. There's no garage at your particular property, but if there were a garage opener, that type of thing. At the end of the lease term, all of those things are supposed to be returned to you unless you designate somebody else. For lead paint, in your situation, your house was built before 1978. So you're going to check this off, saying that it does apply. You're going to check off, you're going to sign here, and you're going to check off saying you have no knowledge and you have no reports pertaining to anything about lead. The tenant then is supposed to receive a copy of any information you do have, which you don't, and they're supposed to receive this pamphlet about protecting your family from leading your home. I can send you a copy of that. They're then supposed to initial here as your tenant, okay? That's a federal requirement. There's no agent involved in the preparation of this lease. If there were, then I would initial there. You guys are then going to sign under that special place. You are the lessor, they are the lessee, right? Service member. There is a provision of federal law that says if a member of active service receives change of duty orders, then you have to be willing to release them to the lease. That's in the Florida statute. There's also federal provision for it. Just call me if that were to happen and you didn't want it to happen or needed guidance at that point. The access to the premises provision at 15 just states when you're allowed to access the premises. In a roommate situation, a little bit unique there, but basically you're allowed to go anytime for the protection or preservation of the premises. So for example, you wouldn't need a roommate's permission to walk into their room if you saw smoke coming from underneath the door or flowing water coming from underneath the door. At any time for reasonable notice. So say you were going to have a painter or an electrician come in to do something in a bedroom. You just want to let them know. Reasonable notice, 24 hours is always sufficient. To inspect the premises upon notice, to make for repairs, those types of things. Here are your requirements. You either have to get their consent, it needs to be an emergency, or you can go after written notice if a tenant unreasonably withholds consent. So if you've asked them 3 times, hey, I need to get this electrician in here, they keep saying no, 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 you can just give them written notice, say, hey, the electrician's coming at this time. This talks about what happens if a tenant abandons the place or you perceive they might have. Homeowners association is not going to apply in your particular instance, so nothing to worry about there. Okay, page 6. Use of premises. Basically says, don't be disturbing your tenants. Give them private and free use of the property, at least their exclusive rented portions. In your roommate situation, I would encourage you at the inception of this portion, be specific about what they have exclusive use to. So you're leasing to the tenant the land and building located at 318 Meadowbrook Lane, parenthetically, private use of southwest bedroom, something like that, just to delineate that it is a bedroom lease inside the larger property. Didn't mention that before. Okay. Prohibited acts by landlord, risk of loss. Let's talk about that. So risk of loss says that they are responsible for their own loss. You're responsible for your own loss. So you're going to insure the property and they need to insure their stuff. If there were a tree to fall on the property, you're going to be responsible for the roof and the floors and the doors and the windows and the walls. They're going to be responsible for their bed, their clothing, their electronics, all of those types of things. They should carry liability insurance or tenant insurance to cover their stuff. Okay. You're not allowed to harass them. You're not allowed to force your way into the house without notice. You're not allowed to steal their deposit money, things like that. Casualty damage clause talks about what happens in the event of a big loss. Say there were a tree that fell on the property. This says that they can terminate the lease with 30 days notice after damage or destruction and will immediately vacate the premises. It also gives you the right to ask them to move or live elsewhere and abate rent by fair market value if the premises is damaged beyond their ability to use it, and rent would be prorated in that instance, but just call me if something like that were to come up. 21, legalese for the attorneys. It talks about what should happen if a leasee fails to fulfill their responsibility, and the chapter of Florida statute that governs residential tenancies. 22, more legalese, says that the lease is subject to any mortgage or lien that you place on the property. So a tenant can't say, oh, I have this leasehold right, and uphold a mortgagee from foreclosing if you stop making your payments. 23 talks about liens. It says that your interest should not be subject to any liens for improvements made by the tenant. Other places in the lease, it talks about the tenants not being able to perform any work without your consent. But say they were to have a driveway installed, or install a tankless water heater or something like that without your permission, their workers could not then come to you and expect you to give lien against the property for work that was unpaid by the tenant, something like that. Renewals and extensions at 24, only valid in writing and must be signed by both of you. Terms can't exceed 1 year. New lease is required each year. Otherwise, it's going to default to a month-to-month agreement, and you wouldn't have the ability to hold them hostage if they were to give you short notice of intention to vacate. Tenant's telephone number at 25 just says they have to keep their contact information up to date with you. 26 says that if you were to sue them or they were to sue you, prevailing parties entitled to reimbursement of fees. 27 is more legalese, talks about time is of the essence, meaning that deadlines are time sensitive, and talks about how it's binding upon your heirs. There's not agreement to accept surrender of the premises from the tenant without your consent, things like that. If you have questions, feel free to ask. Any version of this is permissible, whether it's electronic, copy, or whatever. And then there's a disclosure here related to radon gas. You don't need to worry about broker's commission in this instance, but at 29, you do need to make an election. You want the tenant to sign here, which just basically says if they were to die and there is nobody to come take their stuff, you're not liable to store it. I know that sounds weird, seems weird, but that is a weird provision of law after the death of a last remaining tenant. Last page is just everybody's signatures and initials. So you're going to sign, you're going to date, they're going to sign, they're going to date, and say I were to fill this out for you, I would fill in that information. I hope all of that information is helpful. You then are supposed to attach and provide for them a copy of the Florida statutes. The written version of this lease that I gave you from Florida Realtors includes that attached to the back. That's why it's so thick, but that is just a copy of the law that governs everything residential tenancy. This addendum you'll also want to execute. I would check off this. Say don't agree to liquidated damages or an early termination fee. Basically, that protects you as the landlord, gives you all the rights that you could have by statute in the event that the tenant defaults or leaves early, rather than there being a predetermined termination fee. So say, for example, in a situation where you had 3 students in the fall, if you had this provision filled out here, a tenant could give you notice to vacate or default on their lease and pay 2 months termination fee and leave you, in October, and you'd be out multiple months rent with no ability to collect from them for the remainder of the semester while you're trying to find somebody else, that type of thing. You want to keep them on the hook, basically. So signatures, dates, all of that, and then your document is complete. If you need a more summary version, or if when you're ready to actually prepare one, you'd like help with it, feel free to ask.